Hi everyone. I think I'll make a start and hopefully people can join as time goes on. But welcome to our GASOC Innovations event this evening on AI in global health. For those of you who are new to GASOC, we are the global anesthesia, surgery, and obstetric collaboration, and we work with the main goal of increasing trainee engagement in global surgery activity and run a variety of different events for these, such as the event that we're having tonight with various speakers from different backgrounds coming to talk about their perspectives in global health. My name's Meghna. I'm the Innovations and Technology representative for our collaboration, and I'm currently a core surgical trainee based in Leeds. Today's session will be exploring how innovative technologies from AI-enabled digital health tools to medical devices can be effectively evaluated and translated into real-world healthcare, particularly in resource-constrained settings. I'm delighted that we have two excellent speakers with us tonight. First, we have Giovanni Milandri, who's a senior research and development lead engineer who will share his experience from the engineering side of things in developing and evaluating surgical technologies which are able to make a meaningful impact globally. And our second speaker, Dr. Arun, who is a NIHR academic clinical fellow and a resident ophthalmologist, who will discuss how robust evaluation of devices can help us ensure that AI technologies are safe and effective and ready for clinical use. We'll take some questions after each of the presentations, and we'll have some time for discussion as well. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat throughout the session. I'll be monitoring the chat box and I can relay them to the speakers at the end of their talks. Just to note to everyone, this meeting will be recorded and uploaded to our GASOC hub after as well. So being part of this meeting is consenting to the recording as well. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Giovanni. So feel free to start your slides now.
Thanks, Meghna. And let me just check I can get that started. I will try and do it this way. Mm. Is that working?
I can see it's on the PowerPoint page.
Okay. Better?
Yeah, that's better. That's working.
Okay, stopped around. Okay. Nice. All right, and good evening. So I wanted to start with two related questions. And if we're thinking about the ideal scenario, how much resources could we save in global health if we could get the right treatment to the right patient and avoiding costly delays or wastage? And related question, do innovations and trials in global surgery waste valuable resources given the critical constraints? So basically, does the innovation process and trialing of those innovations consume valuable resources which could be rather spent on clinical care? So I'm Giovanni Milandri, a research engineer, and I've helped to run 6 clinical trials in global surgery. And I'd like to make the case that when they're designed and carried out well, then clinical trials are as essential for innovations as for traditional trials such as vaccines, diagnostics, and for medications. So yes, and as Meghna mentioned, this is from an engineer's point of view, and I hope that yields a different perspective. So I would say that global health absolutely requires its own innovation approaches. And a couple of reflections on that were that many small innovations in global health could have a very large impact. There often are underexplored areas where certain innovations could be developed or could be implemented, which could have a much bigger impact than the cost of implementing them. Many local innovations we found aren't widely adopted. So people come up with great ideas and innovate locally, but they don't always share them. It doesn't always go to a scale around the world. And the trickle-down effect for innovation is extremely slow and often doesn't work. So it's got a lot of problems with the innovation trickle-down concept, where we assume that high-income countries will develop innovations and then eventually they will reach low income settings. And adoption requires systems and knowledge at a local level. So innovations often fail when you try and implement them locally because there's often a local knowledge of healthcare. So generally, I would conclude that parachute type of innovations are risky, and is AI maybe one of these? So if we think about AI and the influence on innovations, the AI in clinical practice is new, but the underlying global health challenges are still they still remain. They still are very much the same challenges we knew 20 years ago, for instance. However, the possible benefits could be reduced administrative burden for clinicians, reduced cognitive load, perhaps, in helping them to think through certain treatments or other things like that. And then perhaps the technology is good enough rather than perfect. We've often found with AI that the getting an answer quickly and effectively, even if there are some small errors in what AI can produce, might be an innovation that is worth implementing, even if we cannot guarantee 100% performance. On the other hand, AI has got challenges, and we always say in engineering is garbage in, garbage out. If we're training a model, we need to make sure that what is being trained is actually suitable to what we want to use it for. There seems to be a worldview bias in AI, and I've seen a report that many AI models can be mapped onto a Protestant worldview, for instance, and sort of a very Western concept, which is not surprising. But we need to think carefully about the bias in the AI tools. And then these questions of responsibility. We all, it's very exciting to use new technologies, but what happens if something doesn't work as we expected? So is this a distraction or false hope, or is it actually going to change medicine? And I would say the jury's out, but we need to, there is a huge potential. So what can AI help with if we're thinking about innovations in global health? So the first thing that comes to mind is all the data-related work that a clinician will do. So things like policy, guidance, things done with software. And I'm working on some projects which implement AI in these types of settings. So helping nurses with their home visits, for instance, and these sorts of things. Administrative innovations like transcription is very exciting because doctors think maybe they don't have to write notes and they can transcribe what they say. But there are a whole lot of technical challenges and legal challenges linked up to that. Diagnostics, prescription, there's all sorts of data-related tasks which clinicians do. Somewhat harder is implementing AI in, let's say, bedside technologies, hospital equipment. Obviously, that's more difficult, surgical tools and devices, and assistive technology. So I've just named a few categories of devices which could have help from AI inputs, but perhaps it's a bit more challenging. I've tried to map out a little bit of an idea of how the innovation works in the way I've experienced it in developing new devices. And I've been based in the UK at what I would call an external university and doing R&D, looking at new devices. And we've got this big box, which is the global health context and needs. And we've got organizations like the WHO, high-income country manufacturers, all interacting with this. And then you've got local government, NGOs, and in this yellow box is the clinical trial. So we can either trial a new device or we can benchmark existing devices. So one of the messages for today is to say it's very important to understand how do you test if something is working in the field. And there's a whole lot of links between them. These local universities are very essential to understanding if we're testing it in the right way in a global health setting. And then I've drawn a dotted arrow to the local manufacturers because it's often a challenging loop, but it can be very essential to providing cost-effective care is to manufacture things in a local setting. I've drawn another arrow there. So I'm going to mention some trials of trauma and rehabilitation innovations. This is innovation, but not AI strictly. But I would like to draw some learnings from that in terms of the way we might test AI. So we know globally that trauma is a greatly increasing challenge, and it constitutes about 8% of deaths worldwide. And road traffic accidents is a key factor there, and war and conflict is also a key factor. We've got injuries and falls. So we need the right devices to overcome this clinical gap, basically to get the cost-effective devices into the right clinical spaces. We have challenges of the supply chain. We have challenges of costs of manufacturing. I mean, you have also have lack of evidence of what is the best device for a particular setting. And in Sri Lanka, we've seen a almost fourfold number of cases of trauma since 1990 to 2017 in this graph. So it's a huge area of increasing need. So this was an external fixator. So I'll go relatively quickly through the trial, and you're obviously welcome to ask more questions afterwards, just to give you an idea of the type of work. So external fixators are priority medical devices. They seem to be a part of frontline humanitarian skill sets. In some examples, training people to use these devices has dramatically reduced the amputation rate, for instance, from 100% to around 10 to 20%. So the impact can be enormous. And locally developed fixators have resulted in very low costs per patient of $12 in one particular study. But these types of data are very difficult to come by. So we developed an external fixator, which was supposed to be let's call it some sort of widely utilizable device. And we published design and test results, surgical user guide, cadaver test results, and usability trials. So the idea is to manufacture this in local areas or in regional areas. We did a trial in Sri Lanka with ethical approval from the university and from the hospital directors. We registered the trial such that it was transparent and informed consent. And then we applied this device over 12 months with adults over 12 in this hospital. So it was 17 patients. I won't go through all the details, but you can imagine all different types of fractures. Generally, the patient outcomes were very positive. We had very similar outcomes to a much more expensive device, which could go into the thousands of pounds. And in this particular hospital, there was no other device available, and the doctors had to rely on plaster Paris. And the surgeons generally said that they were happy with the device and would like to deploy it in their hospitals, and with a cost price point in the region of, I think we were getting in under £200, so maybe substantially less per the capital expense, but then the cost per patient can drop if you get to reuse the device. So there's just some example photos from the use of the device, and this was a fracture at presentation, and then we'd follow up with the device applied, just to give you a sense of the use of the device. And so we had excellent radiographic and clinically assessed stability and infection results up to the removal of the device. And so the path to clinical impact is then to transfer this design to manufacturer and to arrange regulatory approval in different settings and countries. But we've done a lot of the background work, so these two processes can be relatively quick. Another trial that I was wanting to present was a prosthetic knee trial, well, two different trials, one in Tanzania and one in Cambodia. And we actually did part of this trial in the UK as well in order to check that the results were comparable with high income and middle income country settings. So the global burden, as I mentioned, of trauma is very, very high, and 29 million traumatic amputations due to road traffic accidents, conflicts, and falls. And we know that prosthetic knees are priority medical devices, but only 5 to 15% of amputees in these regions receive prosthetic devices. So one of the challenges is the appropriateness and the way that the devices are designed for particular needs of global, essentially this idea of the parachute device. Most of the devices on the market are copies of high-income country devices. So we did a look deeper at the customer requirements, which is the clinical requirements of what the device must do, and it must work in very many, in harsh environments, which are not, let's say, as controlled as maybe in high-income country settings. So this was a design project, and we developed a new product, this is under strength testing and environmental testing, and that product has now gone to a trial. This is basically testing it in the UK with bilateral amputees, and then we did the trial, compared it essentially to the Red Cross prosthetic knee and their old design, which is on the left, and their newer design, which is on the middle. There were a lot of complaints with the middle design, even though it was a newer design with more features. There were quite a lot of challenges with the deployment. So the Red Cross asked us to test their devices as well and compare to this new device. So we tested with 35 patients with up to 8 months of field use, and we compared to the ICRC, the Red Cross knees, and the patients were their own controls. They did a crossover, so they tried each knee in turn in a random way. And we did ethics in the UK from the university and in Cambodia and Tanzania. So that was the dual ethics approach. These are just some pictures from the trial, and as you can see on the top right, the monocentric knee has a very limited range of motion, and so one of the features of this knee, which was more appropriate, was a high range of motion. So you can see in the far right, at the top corner, the person can squat fully, and you can see in the bottom pictures how a Muslim patient can kneel to pray and sit more comfortably than with the traditional knees. These are just videos of the knees being used, and we found that the knee, because it had very high stability, was able to do a lot, and people were very happy with it. So this is now moved over um, to manufacturing. We're manufacturing near the Red Cross site in Switzerland and manufacturing in South Africa. So let me just see how I'm going to go forward. So reflections and how do these trials relate to AI? So the idea that we came with was that we need to prioritize testing and adoption of devices that demonstrate value. So the trial needs to be well designed, but also needs to demonstrate local value to people that are testing it. So it's not a device which is being tested for convenience, but it's actually tested in a setting that it might be where it might actually be adopted. That we feel is very important. And there's a whole lot of ethical principles which we were applying, some of them from the Declaration of Helsinki, and some of them from some position papers about how to do these trials in a local setting. AI is an exciting and promising innovation, but in the use of, and if we were to design AI-based tools for clinical use, we need to gather evidence in a very similar way. Exactly whether it's making care better, is it actually improving things, and what are the side effects of using a new technology? So, and we've seen waves of generally positive technology. I think in clinical practice, WhatsApp, for all its has generally been positive. Most clinicians tell me that it's improved their care, even though there are questions about its use. Zoom, for instance, and now we see also in some other technologies, which are digital technologies, we're seeing that some of the harms of social media. So my belief is that AI is going to be a very mixed picture. It does have some enormous value, but it could have some social and patient harms that we need to be aware of. And essentially, we need to, as I said, test in a systematic way to agree what technology should be adopted in which setting. And we have the tools to test. We shouldn't leave it to chance. So we shouldn't just adopt things and hope for the best. And in terms of the conclusion, the innovations were trialed successfully, yielding valuable evidence for a broad range of stakeholders, not just for the people designing the product, but also for those who might want to adopt it. And with experienced clinical research partners, we were able to do local research and in a robust way, and it was very much feasible and we got very high quality evidence. The publication quality showed that result. The trials were cost effective. I would think between 10 to 20,000 US dollars. So I think many people have the perception that clinical trials are particularly expensive. And I think that comes from the testing of medications or vaccines where thousands of patients might be necessary. But with devices and with tools and technologies, often smaller groups are very much suitable as a starting point. So, and then as I mentioned before, the ethical approval process is an opportunity to align the values and the benefits to the local setting. So the call to action is let's put AI through its paces and let's give it test it well and make sure that it's adopted correctly. So, and then just acknowledgements from some of the people I've worked with through these trials and some of the organizations in different countries and the enterprise which is manufacturing the device for the prosthetic knee is this GoAssistive technology. So thank you very much. And I didn't check much on time, but I think that was about the correct amount. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Giovanni. That was a very interesting talk and yeah, perfect amount of time.
Okay,
Um,
great.
I think there's one question already in the chat. And everyone else, whoever has any questions, feel free to pop it in the chat and I'll read it out so Giovanni can answer them as well. Visionaries ha asked, how do you ensure leadership of local partners or researchers in testing of digital health technologies or AI, etc.?
This is a good question. I think it's a question that I've been facing. As I mentioned, I've also involved with a UK-based project supporting community nurses in their work, and so maybe that's some aspect. I can speak from that experience. I've had so what tends to happen is that there is this initial um, it's almost like the technology is being brought in, it's being demonstrated to the person who might be able to use it. And there's a lot of excitement around that. And there's a very interesting process of who actually thought that the AI should be used. Who came up with the idea and who and where, what was the context in which the product was actually proposed. So we might have PPI where we would have let's say a focus group with patients or clinicians trying to understand their needs and to bring the voices into their to the let's call it the adoption conversation. But I do believe that there is a high risk of what we call technology push in this instance because when I look at the let's call it the performance of the AI tool to get a good transcription, for instance, often the accuracy is quite low, lower than you might expect. And so the I really believe that the evidence can help those local leaders and local partners to decide. And that's why I would like to include them in the research process, because when they see the positives and negatives and document that for themselves, then I believe that you have the much more powerful, let's say, case for adoption or not adopting something. I really believe when it's tested somewhere else and it gets brought in with some, data, you never know whether that represents your own setting. So yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, no, that was a great insight from you as well. I think that's what I really enjoyed about your talk. Having the specific examples with the clinical trials as well really puts it
Mhm.
in perspective of real life. Arun has also asked, have you encountered any resistance to trialing AI interventions? And if so, where do you think that comes from?
I must say I'm not I haven't taken any AI technologies to trial, so to actual because I come from a medical device framework and we use a lot of medical device regulatory frames to understand how you would get approval, let's say in the UK from the MHRA, for instance. So I am expecting some resistance, let's say from the regulators in, let's say in the UK case, that we have to demonstrate a certain level of performance, which you might, let's say, that conversation of how well the device performs, think should be much more public, in that people are able to see how well the device performs and not just be told, look, it's good enough for your application. So I think the resistance might come from better understanding of how well it does what it seems to do. Um, but I haven't encountered that resistance myself. The only other challenge is that there is some resistance, especially when AI is deployed on sensitive data, to actually sharing that data. And it's quite interesting when you get close to the data, but sometimes the clinicians are cautious to share personal data because they know that you need that personal data to train your AI model, but you at the same time you are having access to a very powerful, you know, set of data. So there is a real tension, and you need very high trust in order to go in and say, look, I need access to your health records. I would like to train my AI system. So it's a problem in the industry at the moment.
Another question is from Frida. She says, what do you think the timeline of implementing AI tools in clinical practice looks like?
This is a good question. When we're thinking about a new, let's call it a hardware device, there's a bit of a joke that everything takes 3 to 5 years, and when I say that in front of the software engineers who are building AI tools, they will, they would laugh at that. They would say, no, we can do that in a 3 to 5 months. Um, but what I found is that the perception of value is very fast with AI. So we've all been there where we go and check something using Copilot or something, seems great, but then later on we think, wait a minute, maybe there's something not quite right here. And I read some report recently where if you read AI text, your brain, your comprehension of that text is slower than if you read text which was written by a human. So your brain is aware that there might be some challenges. The way you read the text, it seems almost too good to be true. And so your brain is looking for clues in the AI response. So what I generally feel is that we'll have some what you call a hype cycle. Essentially, you'll try and implement something very quickly. You'll run into some trouble. And I think recently the UK regulator's given a yellow card to some companies for implementing too quickly, and for not being careful enough with patient data. Um, and so yes, I would think in the region of 2 to 3 years is probably a good amount of time for deployment and for at least for testing and for deciding if it's ready for use.
That's really interesting about your brain registering it differently when it reads that. Vision has asked another question, which is there then a need for a global register of AI applications with a transparent report of training and validation and effectiveness data?
I think the short answer is yes. I think it would be very interesting if a group like GASOC or some, essentially were to start, essentially, I've written another paper, it's not yet published, but which is about benchmarking. And one of the interesting things is that we were very willing to benchmark something like a digital camera or something. We go online and we read, or a new bicycle, we go and read all the performance data of or car, how fast it accelerates, all of those things. We find out all the good things, crash safety, all of those, before we buy it, right? We evaluate a lot of performance data before we choose which car we want to buy. But for some reason in healthcare, we don't often have that level of data that we can actually go and look and read about the, pros, reviews of the product, people saying, what are they saying? And those conversations, I think, are lost in healthcare often because it's behind, paywalls and regulatory frameworks. So I do think there's space for a more public conversation about how well things are working. Recently, the Apple Watch was found out to be only 40% accurate for their cardiac monitoring, for their blood pressure monitoring, and everyone was a bit surprised that Apple would put a product out on the market with a 40% accuracy, but they said it's better than 0%, and you as a clinician can make your mind up of whether with 40% is good enough for screening of patients' hearts. But you can see that these tools are very much knowing that something is 40% accurate is much better than having to just trust the brand or whatever where the source comes from. So I fully agree with that.
Did anyone else have any other questions for Giovanni uh, that they wanted to pop in the chat? He's also kindly said that I can share his email in the chat and he's happy to be contacted as well following this talk. So I'll pop it in the chat here. So if
Thanks,
anyone has
Vega.
any questions that they want to discuss privately with him or any ideas or innovations they want to discuss with him too, I think he'd be a great contact to reach out to.
Yes,
But
if you
thank
want,
you.
I've seen how people can build with AI, can build ideas. I mean, spoke to a GP this morning who's building a whole prescribing tool himself. I was amazed. It's something very new how much people can. Yeah, so clinicians definitely can get involved with trying out new ideas.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think events like this are really great for us to meet people like you, um, because we don't really get exposure to the other side of development of all these sort of tools. So yeah, I think everyone who's here should take up this opportunity
No,
to
of
try
course.
and reach out to
Yeah.
Giovanni if they have
Thanks.
any ideas. But thank you for a very interesting discussion, and also exploring the different limitations and also the things that we have to think about when
Mhm.
implementing AI.
No,
But
pleasure. Great. Thank you.
so now we'll move on to Arun's talk. Arun, if you're ready. So just for a little recap, he is a ophthalmology registrar working in London and also an NIH ARC academic clinical fellow. And he'll be presenting about generative AI in eye surgery. And we can see your slides.
Thanks so much, Magda, and GASOC for the invitation. And thanks, Giovanni, for a great talk. I love trials, so it's really always great to hear other people that are into them as well. I'm an ophthalmology trainee. I'm also an academic, and a lot of my work is on digital health and AI stuff. And in recent years, that's been more the generative AI, the newer forms, the forms that have a lot of hype around them. And so I'll talk a little bit about the technical background, but I'll actually try and focus more on the applications because I think for clinicians, it's much more important to think about what these things are doing rather than how they're labeled or what necessarily goes on in the back end. I'll then talk about a little bit of the challenges around how to push this stuff forwards so that, it actually has an impact. And then I'll talk about a couple of frameworks that you can use to start thinking about these issues, these barriers, and how we can solve them. So, what do we actually mean by generative AI? This is the diagram explaining how the early version of ChatGPT was developed, and I think it's worth looking at the pre-training and fine-tuning elements or stages as the sort of new features of what is generative AI that wasn't done previously. So, in the past, you may have had a deep learning model where you had some kind of architecture that you could throw labeled data at, and over time, that architecture would learn how to produce labels in a similar sort of way. And you could show it new forms of data or new data in the same format, and it would label it pretty well. And I'll talk about how that's used in medicine in a moment. What's different with generative AI is that you have this initial pre-training. So you have huge amounts of data. For ChatGPT, that means text data mainly, although now it's multimodal. And you expose a model to all of that data and you challenge it to reconstruct that kind of data after hiding bits of it. So that could be predicting the next word in a sentence after you've hidden it, something like that. And if you do that over enough data, enough words, enough sentences, you generate a model that is able to produce language that looks like it's produced by a human, sort of matches the same kind of distribution. But it tends to be meaningless. So you have to do this fine-tuning process where you expose the model to inputs, which are things like you might enter into the ChatGPT box, and outputs, which are things that you would want in response to the things that you put into the box. Um, some of that is manual. In reality, the vast majority of that is now automated by AI. And again, if you do that over enough data, you produce a model that produces useful language rather than just any old language in response to queries. And then there's all sorts of sophisticated processes where you can tune that further, optimize for whatever you want to, tone, originality, etc., etc. But that schema is what defines generative AI. And we all know about ChatGPT, but the same sort of thing is done with other modalities. So, for example, we can look at images. You can hide little parts of images and challenge the model to reconstruct the image with that hidden part regenerated. And in a similar sort of way, you then develop a model that can produce images that look real, whether that's an X-ray type image, a fundus photo type image, that sort of thing. And you can then fine tune that model in the same sort of way to do useful things with that type of data, whether that's diagnosing, predicting, or anything else. Um, deep learning, captions are common for me. I don't know why. So for years now, we've had deep learning. Uh, I spoke about it before about using labeled data in the main, where you expose the model to lots of data with good labels. The example in the figure here is for diagnosing glaucoma from photos of the back of the eye. And then after you've done that over enough data, that model should be able to do that labeling process for new images that it hasn't seen before. And it does quite well. And so what you see in this figure is the conventional deep learning performance on diagnosing glaucoma for internal data sets in the black squares, meaning the same kind of data that it's been trained on. And then in the red dots, you see external validation, which is where it's been deployed in more realistic environments, used with data that isn't necessarily used for its training. And what you see is the performance is pretty good, 90% accuracy or so, and especially good for the internal validation. It's a little bit less good for the external validation. So when you release these models into the wild, you do see a drop in performance. It's worth thinking about what generative AI really adds. And this is why I think it's important to think about applications rather than the technology or the labels, because for tasks like this, you do see a bit of an improvement in terms of the metrics. Maybe you see 93% instead of 90%, but that's, a pretty subtle quantitative improvement. It's not a qualitative improvement. You're not really showing new things that haven't been done before by AI. And so really thinking about what an application adds to you is very important to keep at the front and center of your mind with all the sort of hype and excitement around generative AI, foundation models, all of these things. But having said this, there are new capabilities, qualitative changes that are sort of inherent in the technology that we now have, the generative AI. So through lots of, bigger architectures, bigger models, bigger computers, and more data than ever for pre-training and fine-tuning, we're now able to produce models, foundation models, generative AI models that can integrate different forms of data. This wasn't done, very much at all before that. So, for example, vision and language is kind of the easiest conceptually to marry. You can challenge a model to describe images, for example, of X-rays or whatever other medical image it is. Um, and it does quite well. It doesn't probably do as well as the experts for now, and I'll talk a bit about benchmarking in a moment. Um, but that capability is growing. And so we're going to start to see new applications of this technology expanding, growing, coming into your clinical practice over, the sort of medium term at the very least. Thinking about the applications is important. As I've said, that's really my main takeaway message. I categorize it into three sort of broad categories when it comes to healthcare AI, and that's sort of in relation to where the patient is in the pathway. So before a patient ever comes to clinic, there are clinical decisions that are made, which patients to see, when to see them, how soon to see them, who can be deferred into the future. That requires skill, it requires intelligence, but it's often based on quite structured data, some of it unstructured maybe in the form of text, but very, very often quite repetitive tasks that are very amenable to AI. So there's no reason why you can't get some form of generative AI to look at the same kinds of data and aid or automate that kind of decision. When you actually get to the clinic and sort of meet the doctor, there's lots of things that the AI can do to help them. So this is already happening in some sense with the AI scribes, which are extremely popular. But there are other things it may be able to do more on the clinical side. It may be able to suggest diagnoses based on your history. It may be able to integrate the notes, the vast sometimes notes that you see on EPR in real time as you're performing the consultation, saving time and also improving our clinical acumen. And then downstream of that, once you've sort of at least begun to hold the consultation, there are decisions to make. You have to understand what the problems are, what the diagnosis is, and you need to make decisions about what to do about them, whether to order investigations, initiate treatments, surgery, all of those types of things. And again, many of these tasks are quite repetitive, especially in particular clinics. You see the same kinds of case again and again. And so there's no reason why AI can't help. It can learn from what clinicians do in those types of scenario, and it can begin to either assist or automate some of those processes. So I'll talk about a little bit of my work. So we first there were headlines made when ChatGPT passed the USMLE. And so we took those same kinds of model and tested them on more specialty exams that actual qualified doctors do to become consultants or GPs. And at the time, we found that they didn't do very well, which was interesting because we thought that, this is maybe all hype. What we've seen since is that the models do a lot better. So now they're sort of matching experts, at least for the language-based questions, and they're also doing quite well with those multimodal questions. So integrating images and other forms of data and still exhibiting pretty good performance. The performance with the multimodal stuff is not as good as the experts yet, but given the progress that we've seen over about 3-4 years, it's probably going to get there. And so we're going to start seeing this stuff capable of doing more in the clinic. And it's a little bit up to us how much it does and how we integrate it. Some other use cases I've tested have been in research. So there are lots of tasks in research that are repetitive. that use the same sorts of data, and that makes them very, very amenable to automation by something like a language model. And so an example is in systematic review. If some of you have done it, you know the laborious process of screening abstracts and then full texts. This was a study looking at using LLMs to automate that process of abstract screening. And if I briefly explain the results, the red asterisks that you see in the plots on the right, that's what Cochrane reviewers, who are sort of the best in the business, that's what they achieve. You want to be, if you had perfect performance, on the very far right and at the very top of the plot. And what you see is they're quite low down. And the reason for that is with abstract screening, you don't have enough information sometimes to exclude things with confidence. So you're quite permissive with your filters. When we start to integrate the LLMs, what you see is that a lot of them are not very useful because they don't have that recall or sensitivity, meaning they lose relevant records, but some of them are. And so you see there are some points on that 100% recall line on the far right, and so all of them are higher in terms of the precision than the Cochrane reviewers, meaning they were able to exclude more records than the Cochrane reviewers could at abstract screening stage. And that has a lot of implications for efficiency. We all know how hard it is, or if you've ever done a review, you know how hard it is to get through all of that repetitive work, and these tools can help. And then a final set of use cases. So uh, the images that we take of the back of the eye show you blood vessels and nerves in a way that you can't see directly anywhere else in the body. And so there's been recent interest in using that data to predict disease and health status for issues outside the eye. So that could be kidney health, it could be heart health, it could be brain health. It has some good potential. So you can predict all kinds of systemic diseases from eye imaging. And a major advance in this area came when we started to develop foundation models, this form of generative AI with eye imaging. So some of you may have heard of RepFound. That's probably the sort of biggest and most popular one. But there is an issue with it in that all of the data used to train it came from high income countries, plus a couple of exceptions, a couple of data sets from China and India. And that's a problem for your external validity or your external performance. When you start using these models on data that come from outside the type of data or the type of population in which it's been trained, it doesn't do as well. And so this is global RepFound, a diagram of how we're building it. The idea is to find and retrieve and use data from as many countries as possible for that pre-training stage to develop a foundation model that can do more with more generalizable performance. I mean, that's great as an idea, but there are significant barriers. The main one being sort of data privacy and issues with permissions to use data for something like this. And so to get around that, what we're doing is we're working with researchers locally so that they can use their data to train other generative models locally and then use those generative models to produce synthetic data. So data that matches the distribution of what they have in their data sets, but which doesn't have any identifiable information. And so by integrating all of that, we can generate large volumes of data, do the pre-training, and then we can fine tune on things like oculomics tasks and hopefully get much better performance in populations that haven't been represented well before. So all kinds of use cases, but there are issues and barriers to overcome to bring this stuff from the papers and the theoretical work to actual clinical practice. One of these is the standard of research. So, I mean, it's hard to miss that there's been an enormous expansion in research to do with generative AI. A lot of it is very, very poorly informative. It's poorly reported. The methodology is incomplete or insufficient. The results don't really tell you anything about whether or not the model in question can do what it's supposed to be tested on. So one way to try and improve that, which has been done in more traditional forms of research, is to use reporting guidelines so that you enforce standards of practice, but also of reporting to make researchers do better in terms of how they design, implement, and then report their studies. So this is chart. This is a reporting guideline for studies that test generative AI models in providing advice either to patients or to clinicians. And if, I mean, at least it's hoped, if researchers follow all of the chart guideline steps, we'll start to see more studies that give us a clearer idea of what models can and can't do. Clinical governance is another barrier. With AI coming out with variable levels of autonomy, it becomes a little bit unclear who is responsible when decisions are made. Is the AI company responsible? Is the doctor responsible for everything, even if the AI has made a decision autonomously? Um, these are difficult questions that are probably going to be answered differently in different jurisdictions. Europe has a very different framework for law in general than somewhere like the UK or even the US. And so it may not necessarily be a one size fit all solution, but this is another initiative to try and give regulators a framework that they can draw on when they're deciding and determining whether and how to govern these types of application when they're deployed. And then regulation. So it's again, regulators are really scrambling to try and figure out how to decide whether or not an application should be allowed to be used. And a lot of the regulators use frameworks that are to do with the level of autonomy and also the sort of risk inherent in the decision making or the function of the tool itself. And that's all right, but a lot of those frameworks are getting hijacked because there's a thought that something must be done when something like generative AI comes out. And this is another reason why I think it's worth focusing on applications rather than the technology or the labels, because I would suggest it's not really so important what the technology is, what's going on in the back end. What matters is what it does and how well it does it. This is a short paper which is talking about a different sort of approach to regulation, focusing on applications. And we draw on a parallel with autonomous driving. We now see autonomous driving happening in the US. It's actually started in London as well with Waymo. And they've had a lot more success, the companies behind this, in terms of working with regulators. And the reason for that is they sat down with the regulators and they deconstructed driving as this big, complicated thing into constituent or component activities. That might be how well it brakes, how well it signals, how well it observes. And by doing this, you can then agree with the regulators a standard. You can say to them, if it does this well on this task, it should be allowed to do it. If it does this well on all of these tasks, it should be allowed to drive, for example. It should be allowed to be set free. We don't have anything like that in medicine. Our regulation is very, very vague, very broad. And so deconstructing medicine into those component tasks is an approach to let people develop things against an agreed standard. And so there'd be a very, very open and understandable standard to give people security that they know something that has been deployed matches a certain standard, but also allow developers to do things, to invest in things with confidence that if they can achieve a certain benchmark, they will be able to take their device to market. I mean, some of the work I've done makes it sound as though it's maybe simple or that, all we have to do is X, Y, or Z to solve these problems, and it isn't. So a lot of these problems are debatable. People may disagree vehemently on them, and I suspect there'll be very different approaches taken in different jurisdictions. And so the sort of final thing I want to do with everyone is just give a couple of frameworks for how to think about these sorts of issues because your opinions will matter and they do matter and will matter. Because in the future, if we have a lot of small applications with a lot of different functions, we'll probably have a sort of environment where individual clinicians are making decisions about what to use and what not to use. And so it's critical, really, that you have a good idea of what to think about when making that type of decision. But you're also important stakeholders. People in tech, people in regulation want to hear from clinicians because they are the people on the ground. They understand the problems. They understand the pain points. They are the experts in their domain. And so the first framework is probably something many of you have come across. It's the kind of thing that comes up in medical school ethics. It's the 4 pillars. So autonomy, meaning patients having the ability to choose. Beneficence, making sure that interventions that we introduce do good, make things better, make patients' outcomes better. Non-maleficence, which is kind of the opposite. So making sure that our interventions don't do harm, don't make things worse. And justice, meaning that things are fair or equitable. And these things can conflict. So it's very, very rare that you find some solution, some proposal that maximizes all of these. But being able to talk about the implications in terms of these four pillars gives you a very, very useful framework that you can then use to initiate debate, but also to make convincing arguments from if you have a strong point of view. And then this final framework is a way to think about particular concerns and problems. So the two broad ways are utilitarian ways. So you can think about whether or not an intervention or a solution or a policy or a proposal makes things better or worse in measurable ways. That's very broad. There's lots of things that can be measured. You can look at clinical outcomes. You can look at time or efficiency. You can look at people's well-being and satisfaction. All of these things are valid measures, but that's what it means to be utilitarian, to look at things that are measurable and to make your interventions more or less optimized based on what it does to those measurements. A very different way of looking at it is deontological, and that refers to thinking about whether or not a course of action is right, regardless of its effect on measurable outcomes. So there are some people who feel very strongly about what AI should and shouldn't do, for example. And these are different. They often conflict, but people are very rarely purely utilitarian or purely deontological. Usually people have some ideas that are guided by one and by the other. And so being able to think about which category your concerns fits into, again, makes it easier for you to make convincing arguments. And some of those concerns are things like validation, which we've talked about, trying to improve that standard, governance, which is, enforcing standards and making sure that people are kept safe as technology is implemented. And of course, the regulation, which is kind of deciding what is and what isn't allowed to be used, usually on a national level. So very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks for a great talk, Arun. I was thinking that it was quite interesting that you touched on clinical governance, because I think going back to the other talk, one of the things that I feel like puts clinicians off, is just this fear of medical legal risks, when using AI, and again, who the responsibility falls with. And I know you said if you asked people, everyone would probably have a different answer, but I was just interested to hear what your answer would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think currently most of the tools we have are not sort of autonomous decision makers. They're very much aids. So the most common one is scribing, whether it's, Heidi Health or one of these other applications. And I would suggest that, it is still the doctor's responsibility what goes in the notes, and what is done as a result of any sort of transcription software. So I think for most of the tools that are available, we're in a position where doctors have to take responsibility for what is done. They can't sort of fall back and blame the AI or something like that. But that may change. So there are already some autonomous AI applications, things for like diabetic retinopathy screening in ophthalmology, not in the UK, but in many other countries. And there you don't have a clinician that's responsible. And the program is sort of ultimately responsible if there's harm, but it's a complicated question as to who is responsible and who should get the blame, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Um, we also have a question from Frida, who says, since the laws will most likely vary from regions and countries, how would this affect the application across these regions and countries? Do you think that it will create a wide and noticeable gap in technologies used in the countries which have tighter regulations compared to those where the laws make it easier to implement?
I think the answer is yes to that. So, I mean, you can see countries that work very, very hard to facilitate this are doing much better. So that would be in practice the US and China. They are leaps and bounds ahead. Part of that is economic power, of course, but they have a very, very different approach to innovation with regards to AI than somewhere like Europe or even the UK. UK is a little bit in the middle ground, but is less permissive than somewhere like the US. And so, yes, I think it is likely that you're going to see technology used at wider scale somewhere like the US. It's hard to predict how that maps across the entire world. Every country is slightly different, but it absolutely does have a very, very large effect. And the example I'd use is the diabetic retinopathy screening. We have AI that can do this autonomously, see people with diabetic eye disease, It's used in the US, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, I think 13 countries in total. It's not used in the UK, and that's because of our very, very strict regulation. So, yes, is the answer.
It's interesting because obviously it's such a high burden on the health system here, and it would save so many resources. But I guess these sort of things take time to implement, and like you said, regulations will always sort of hold those sort of things back. Did anyone else have any questions for Arun?
Maybe I'll just ask it in with the microphone. But with the, I've found sometimes AI tools are referred to in when we talk about governance and we talk about what we should expect from them, and what are these. If you look at self-driving cars, for instance, we have a certain higher bar for them than we would for a human driver, for instance. Yeah. Are there some efforts to maybe to compare governance of AI tools to the way we govern human clinicians and the way they make decisions, as opposed to let's say, governing the tool by the way we govern machines?
There hasn't been very much, and I think the reason for that is that human clinicians aren't governed that closely. So
Okay.
think that there are governance processes in place when doctors do bad things, when they're referred to a regulator. But on a day-to-day level, there's a very, very broad spectrum of practice, both in terms
Mhm.
of individual choices and personality, but also quality.
Mhm.
Everyone here will have seen better and worse doctors. And there isn't much done to kind of enforce a particular standard or way of doing medicine. But I do think we can draw on the sort of education aspect to do a bit because the way most medical students are taught medicine is quite modular. We're taught quite, so the famous model is the Cambridge Calgary model for communication, where you learn how to sort of initiate and then elicit concerns and then screen for symptoms. These are very modular things that would map quite well, I think, to sort of an AI consultant.
No, thank you. Just a bit of a slightly a comment, but also a question. Because I work mostly in medical devices, the UK regulator is often pushing AI tools into the medical device framework, even maybe those regulations that you mentioned, because in some senses it gives them the maximum permission to go into the market. So, once you get classified as a medical device and you show your device is safe, then they give you complete free rein, to go anywhere in the UK without any other controls. Do you think there might be some sort of more progressive regulatory framework where you allowed, not just a single hospital, but maybe five hospitals, sort of a deployment um, sequence with evidence being gained at each step, multi-center and then um,
Um,
national?
Yeah, so maybe I think that would be preferable to what we have now. I mean, my experience is in ophthalmology, and so the diabetic retinopathy example, just to expand on it a bit more, the regulators have said we have to do these silent trials before we can deploy it safely. Meaning we put it into practice alongside existing processes, and it doesn't actually make any decisions,
Mhm.
just to make sure it works. And that, to me, makes sense if it's a new technology, but not so much when it's tried and tested internationally with quite good success. So
Mhm.
I mean, to me that's an issue, but
Okay.
it is hard coming up with a solution, and that's why I think a sort of application-based framework where you think about what it's doing specifically is
Mhm.
helpful. But I realize that's also hard because there are so many different ones.
Mhm. Thanks.
Andy, if you put your message in the chat, I can read it out for you. Just give them. And if anyone else has any questions that they have, just pop it in the chat and I can read them out to Arun. Um, in the meantime, I will also just direct everyone to there's a feedback form for this session, which I've just pinned to the group. If you fill that in, then we can give you certificates for attending today. Um, I will also just let people know about two opportunities that we have with GASOC at the moment. So we have our postpartum hemorrhage innovation competition for this year. I will just put the information in the group, but we're looking for 3-minute presentation video pitches, and the deadline for this is the 15th of September this year. And we also have our GASOC conference coming up in November, for which we are accepting abstracts until the 15th of August. So I would recommend trying to get something in. I will also send the details of that in the group. Did anyone else have any other questions?
What's the blood clock invented by Graham Deedman?
I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure. I was hoping to look up before I sent it, but I was too interested in your talk. And this is the information about the conference that we have. And Vision has kindly sent some information about the blood clock, so everyone can find out as well. If there's no more questions, thank you both for both of your talks. I think they've both been very thought-provoking, and it's interesting to hear from different perspectives as well. And thank you both also for providing your contact details for people to get in touch if they have any questions after the event. But from GASOC, we really appreciate you giving your time to provide some of your expertise in this field, because it's a really interesting topic. And I think you both touched on some very relevant and potential issues and how we might address these as well in the future. And I think inevitably it's going to be something that we all come across in our clinical and non-clinical work.
Thank you, Magna, for organising. Cheers.
Thank you. I'll stop the recording now. If anyone has anything they are interested in for future innovations events, then please send me an email, or you can contact through the GASOC website as well. And I'd be happy to see if we can liaise and work out an event regarding that in the future.